Okay, thank you everyone for coming back. This session will be dealing with chapter 12 of our textbook, and it deals with capacity planning. And capacity planning, these are the things we hope to discuss in this particular video. And with capacity planning really is about making planning decisions that are long range, medium range, or short range in nature. And these type of decisions follow naturally with the supply chain decision that's already been made in the forecasting information that you have developed and learned about as part of the input. And those capacity decisions must align with the operation strategy of the particular firm. Some of these capacity decisions are based on forecasted estimates of future demand. Facilities, aggregate planning, and scheduling form what we see here, this hierarchy of capacity decisions at the bottom of page 285, 286. That particular figure is 12.1 on top of 286. And when you think about the planning operations from a long to medium to short term in nature, we have to consider this hierarchy of planning. And we see the first one called facility planning, or facility decisions, are long-term in nature and made to obtain the physical capacity that must be planned, developed, and constructed before to ensure its intended use to meet the needs of the organization. Then we have this second one called aggregate planning, which determines the workforce level and production output levels for the medium term within the facility capacity and its availability. And finally, we have the scheduling, which consists of short-term decisions that are constrained by the aggregate planning and allocates the available capacity by assigning it to the specific activities. Again, this is figure 12.1 on top of page 286. And when we define this term of capacity, sometimes it is referred to as peak capacity as well. As the maximum output that can be produced over a specific period of time, maybe a day, week, or month. And this capacity can be measured in terms of output measures such as the number of units produced, tons produced, number of consumers served over a specific period. It also can be measured from a physical asset availability, such as the number of hotel rooms available or the labor availability, such as consulting or accounting services. And then when we have this term of capacity, it really is about the output that can be performed over a period of time, whether it's theoretical or effective capacity. Then we get into this term called utilization. Utilization is that relationship between the actual output and capacity, between the actual output and capacity, and is defined by this formula of utilization equals output capacity, equals actual output divided by capacity times 100%. Utilization is seldom 100% in reality, and typically sometimes there's this slack capacity which is needed for planned and unplanned events. And these utilization rates, as you can imagine, will vary from industry or firm or from organization to organization. It is possible in the short term for a firm to operate above peak capacity or 100% utilization. It may require increased overtime, increased workflow. That typically that time frame is short time frame. It's certainly operating above peak capacity is not sustainable in the long term. You may have worker burnout, morale issues, may not have the forecasting and demand may not be as accurate as you would have thought. You could have equipment breakage. You could have supply shortages. So you can operate it above capacity utilization factor above 100% in the short period, but it's really not something that you can withstand in the long run, typically. In addition to this theoretical peak, there's an effective capacity that's obtained by subtracting the downtime from maintenance, shift breaks, schedule changes, absenteeism in workers, retooling, supply shortages, anything, or in other words, anything that may reduce the capacity and its availability. So those key terms over on page 286, 287. Then let's talk about facility strategy in its decisions. Facility decisions typically is the longest term capacity planning decisions that are of great importance to the firm, as you can imagine, because it's a long term, really setting the stage of where the organization is going to be going, what's going to be the significant capital outlay or capital investment. And anytime you're talking about physical facilities, it typically takes on a long range view, much more than just a month or two, up to including 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5-year time spans. And when you're making these type of facility decisions, these are just a few of the questions that you may have to ask yourself, certainly not all inclusive, but a few. How much capacity is needed? How large should the facility be? When is the capacity needed? Where should the facilities be located? And what type of facilities or capacity will be needed? These questions are much about how much, how large, when, where, and what type that can be looked into as you're considering expansion of the organization. And part of these facility decisions go into facility strategies. And the facility strategies on the bottom of page 288 really discusses the amount of capacity, the size of the facility, the timing of the capacity changes, certainly the facility locations, the types of facility needed that's going to be in the long run. These type of strategies certainly has got to be coordinated with other functional areas in the organization due to the investment, especially capital, the market size that's going to determine the amount of capacity needed, the workforce that's going to be needed in order to staff the new facilities, the cost of the new facilities when it comes to accounting practices, and the type of technology decision that's going to be needed as you build these new capacities and equipment and things of that nature. So the engineering perspective. So you can see it's pretty demanding when you're thinking about a facility decision that you got to think broad picture and not just think in short term or in isolation of the immediate term. You really got to think long term when it comes to this type of capital investment. Some of the factors that affects these type of decisions, again, not all inclusive, but just as a starting point, what's the predicted demand? This is where your forecasting models that you will be exercising in this week and what we saw in chapter 11 really comes into play. What's going to be the cost of the facilities? Because it certainly is a huge capital investment that's going to be shared throughout the organization. It may, if it's a bad decision, rob other segments of the organization from expanding as well. What are our competitors doing? What would be their anticipated response if we were to expand our facilities? What's the business strategy, and how would that dictate where the company will place its emphasis? Will it place it more on cost, service, or flexibility in its service offering? Where will the organization go? And certainly then you have the international considerations. Again, as we talked about in chapter 11, how much the global economy and how we're so globally connected today in the marketplace that you have to consider where's your next market. And in some cases, you're going to be relocating those facilities in a global market. One part of the facility strategy certainly is the amount of the capacity needed, and this is typically determined by the forecast demand and by a strategic decision of how much capacity that's going to be needed in relationship to the expected demand. This type of of capacity can be best described by the notation of capacity cushion, which is defined by 100% minus the utilization factor. And this capacity cushion, again, is the difference between the output that a firm could achieve and the real output that it produces to meet demand. Since capacity utilization reflects the output required to satisfy that demand, a positive cushion means that there's more capacity available that is required to satisfy demand, which means you may have excess inventory. And zero cushion means that the average demand equals the capacity available, which would certainly minimize the cost, but has some risk associated with that as well, especially if you get a extremely high order that you don't have the inventory to meet. And this is linked back to how important your forecasting models and the robustness of those forecasting models that we saw in Chapter 11 comes into play to ensure that you have the right demand, the right inventory, the right capacity to meet that demand. Typically, there's three strategies that can be adopted with respect to amount of the capacity cushion, and we see that over on page 290, where we talk about large cushion, which is typically a large positive capacity cushion with capacity of excess of the average demand is planned. In other words, the firm intentionally sets and builds excess capacity above the average demand forecast. And this type of strategy is certainly appropriate when you're expanding into a new market or when the cost of building and operating capacity is inexpensive relative to the cost of running out of capacity. Then we have this term called moderate cushion, which is where the firm is more conservative with its respect of capacity. And capacity is typically built to meet the average forecast demand comfortably with enough capacity to satisfy unexpected changes. But it's not one of those strategies where it's used when the cost or consequences of running out is proximately in balance with the cost of excess capacity. Then we have the third one called small cushion. It's where a small or nearly zero capacity cushion is planned to maximize utilization. This type of strategy is appropriate when that capacity is very expensive, when it's related relative to stockouts, and they give a few good examples there of oil refiners and paper mills and other very capital intensive industries. So when planning the capacity cushion, the firm has got to determine what's going to be the probability of various levels of demands that we see here, then use those demands as part of their predicting modeling about planned increases or decreases in the capacity, and then decide what's going to be the size of their facilities in order to meet that ever-changing demand. Or in other words, how will they address how large each unit of capacity should be, and how will they go about meeting that particular demand. This type of question typically involves the economies of scale, and we know that production costs are not linear, and based on the notion that large facilities are generally more economical because the more they can produce, the more those fixed costs are spread over more units of production. Economies of scale that we see, you see here the figure 12.2 is a good indicator of the economies of scale per unit cost, and the other term called diseconomies of scale. So it's a good news, bad news stories. Whereas the facility gets larger, diseconomies can occur for several reasons. One of those first being the logistics. One large manufacturer incurs more transportation costs potentially to deliver their goods to the market than two other smaller facilities that are certainly closer to the market. So facility strategy, facility decisions comes into play here. This economies of scale can also occur between the coordination of cost in the large facilities Obviously, you have more employees, more layers of staff and management. As a result of that, more bureaucracy, more processes, and all of that has a natural occurring diseconomies of scale, which certainly can increase your overall production cost. And then it's related also, thirdly, to the complexity and the confusion that may rise as more products and more services are added to a single facility. And it's kind of, you kind of see that again in that figure 12.2 on what's going to be the optimum facility size. So then another element of this capacity planning over on page 291 deals with the timing of the facility decisions. These type of decisions are at times two opposing strategies. They preempt the competition. In this particular one, that particular firm is a market leader, and they're leading by building capacity in advance and the needs of the market. They are predicting what the market is going to need and going to be a leader in that market. And they typically have a positive capacity cushion, which may actually stimulate the market while at the same time preventing competition because they're able to keep their prices, production costs so low that the competition just can't match it, and at times will keep the competition at bay. Apple, it was a good example that they used here. Then we have this wait and see strategy where the firm wants to wait to add capacity when the demand develops and the need for capacity is clear. So this really boils down to me risk aversion. The preempt the competition certainly has some advantages as well as wait and see advantages and disadvantages. Where preempt the competition, I want to be the market leader. There's risk associated with that, certainly first to the market where you're going to have your competition learn from all of your mistakes, and they will may wait and see what's going to happen before they jump into it. So they let you develop all the technology, do all the footwork, make all the mistakes, then learn from your past mistakes to minimize theirs. But then it really boils down to what's the tolerance of risk. Preempt the competition certainly is a more riskier strategy than wait and see. Wait and see is more of just what it means. When the demand is there, we'll move. But yet, while you're waiting for the demand to be there, your competition may be doing the preempt the competition strategy and already beat you to the market. So it truly is a risk aversion type of ordeal you have to consider when you're making these type of decisions with reference to adding facilities. Okay, let's talk about facility location. Facility location is another one of those that have become more complex with globalization as we expanded the marketplace. And as a result of that, we have more options of locating capacity in these developing new markets. And location decisions are made by considering both quantitative and qualitative factors. Some of the quantitative factors that affect the location may include what's our return on investment, what's our net present value, transportation costs, taxes, lead times for delivery goods, labor availability, things of that nature. Where qualitative factors may include what's going to be the cultural norms, the language barriers, the time zone differences, as an example, what's going to be the difference in worker behavior, worker availabilities. Do they have the workers? Do they have the customers? Is there a need for that particular goods or services? What's going to be the proximity is with reference to the location of these facilities to our customers, our markets, our suppliers, and our competition. So all of that has got to be considered, and not all inclusive, because as you know, when you're thinking about going overseas, you got to be concerned with the labor availability. Do they have the infrastructure, the rail system, the seaports, the airways, the highways, the electrical utilities, the water, the sewage? Do they have the raw materials? Do they have the technological infrastructure that's going to be needed? Do they have the educational system that's going to be needed so you have a pool of ready human resources. So all of that has got to be considered, along with the governmental regulations. How friendly are they to new companies moving into their market share? What's their import and export regulations? What's their tax rate? A big discussion here in this country is the corporate tax rate. So all of that has got to be considered, right along with how stable is that particular country in that particular market from a political standpoint. So location of facilities, certainly this is a few of the factors, but it expands much, much more than that, as you would recognize. Different type of facilities certainly is going to be determined on the type of organization that is wants the plant to accomplish this. And this is just an example at the bottom of page 292, 293, when it comes to product focused, market focused, process focused, and general purpose, with the percentage of different type of percentages that were just allocated for this one. So as an example, for product-focused facilities, they typically produce one family or type of product or service, usually for a large market, which the type of facility decision typically make it 55% of those product-focused type decisions. Where market-focused facilities are located in the markets in which they serve. You have a lot of service facilities that fall into this type of category. Because those type of services are generally not transportable. Then we have the process focused facilities that may have one technology or two at most, and this is where they do a lot of product component or sub-assemblies that supply to other firms as they further do their manufacturing process. Then we have the general purpose, which produces several types of products using several different type of processes. And the operations leader at BMW at the bottom of page 293 is a good example of this logistics, where they use mathematical optimization models, mixed linear programming. If you've ever had management science in your undergraduate degree, then you should be familiar with this term of mixed linear programming, that is used as one tool in a management toolbox to provide quantitative type data in making decisions, a whole host of various decisions. And one of those certainly would be, do we build a facility here, or do we build it somewhere else, and what's going to be the total net present value or the cost to that organization. But they use mixed linear programming here in the BMW as strategic capacity. A good read here at the bottom of page 293. Now, over on page 294, let's talk about sales and operations planning, or S&OPs, is a term used by many firms to describe the aggregate planning process, whereas aggregate planning is the activity of matching supply of output with demand over the medium time range. Over the medium time range. So this time frame between 6 months and 2 years into the future, and typically will average about 12 months or 1 year. In this term, aggregate implied that the planning is done in a single overall measure of output, or at most a few aggregate categories. Then we have that there are several broad definitions of S&OP with these characteristics associated with a time horizon of 12 months, aggregate level of demand for a few categories of the product, the possibility of changing both supply and demand variables, a variety of management objectives, which may include low incentives, good labor relations, low cost flexibility, good customer service, and facilities that are considered fixed and cannot be expanded or reduced. And again, we see that communication or that discussion on page 294, 295. Then we have this cross-functional nature of the S&OP. And then we got to look at this again from the medium term time frame. And that is the primary responsibility of the operations function. But it requires cross-functional coordination and cooperation with all functions within the firm, including what we see here: budgeting, HR, operations, accounting, finance, and marketing. So it's not a standalone system per se, but it is a coordination, functional coordination, functional cross-functional coordination, cooperation of all the firm, all the functions within a particular firm. And you see on page 297, figure 12.3, that kind of gives us a graphical representation of that discussion of S&OP as it relates to an ERP production plan process. What are some of the planning options over on page 297? This process can be clarified as we look at the various decisions options that could be available for S&OP process, and that's typically from a demand management as well as supply management. So let's look at the demand management first, where we think about pricing. Looking at differential pricing as a way to reduce peak demand or to build up demand in off-peak periods. Look at advertising and promotion, which are typically used to stimulate and to smooth out some of those trends as we do our predictive modeling. Backlogs or reservations is to look at how we can how our demand at times can be influenced by asking customers to wait for their orders, a backlog, or by reserving capacity in advance through reservations. Another one is the development of complementary offerings. Certainly during high seasonal demands, try to develop products that had counter-cyclic seasonal trends. So that is a few examples of demand. Now let's look at supply over on page 298, which it also includes a variety of factors that can be used to increase or decrease supply through the aggregate planning process. Hiring and laying off employees is certainly one of those based on seasonal demands. And if I think about seasonal demands, I see it a lot with Walmart when they will hire additional workers, or Amazon will hire additional workers, especially during the peak holiday season. We see it also with some of the home building supply companies like Lowe's and Home Depot, where they will hire seasonal workers during the spring and summer and lay them off late fall and in the winter when home construction is not as robust as it typically is, or home improvement is not as robust as it typically is during the cold winter months. So you hire and lay off employees. They could be using overtime and undertime as a strategy to meet supply, using part-time or temporary labor, carrying inventory, even up to and including subcontracting or outsourcing some of their work, and certainly making cooperative arrangements or cooperative agreements. And you see a lot of that through sharing of networks, and you see that certainly with I know in the electrical utility business we had cooperative arrangements with a lot of neighboring utilities. Now let's talk about the aggregate planning strategies over on page 299 to 300. There are two basic planning strategies that can be used, as well as any combination of these two, to meet the medium-term aggregate demand. One strategy is to maintain a level workforce, and the other is to chase demand with the workforce. So with a perfect level strategy, the size of the workforce and the rate of regular time output are constant. And this is where variations in demand is absorbed by using inventories, overtime, or temporary workers, or cooperative arrangements. With the chase strategy, the size of the workforce will vary, and they will vary to meet, or in other words, chase what's the demand. We see this a lot again in seasonal seasonal type marketplaces where we use the example of Amazon, Walmart, Lowe's, and Home Depot. So you typically have these two type of strategies of level strategy and chase strategy. And over on page 301, we have this comparison of chase and level strategies, table 12.1, which kind of gives us, again, another data table representing that type of strategy. Then we go into the page 301, continuing with the aggregate planning cost, where when you think about aggregate planning, certainly as all of this is driven to minimize cost so that we can charge less for our goods, services, and our product, so that we can maintain our market share and hopefully expand that market share and be cheaper than our competition. And when the demand is given, you got to consider the cost. Some of those costs we see here with the different strategies is hiring and layoff costs, with chase strategy, overtime and undertime, subtracting costs, and part-time labor costs are all chase type strategies, where inventory carried cost and cost of stock out or back order is typically a level type strategy. But that discussion is over on 301, 302. And over on page 302, 303, aggregate planning example, and you can see that figure 12.4, where they have the company demand forecast and how that forecast peaks in the June, July timeframe, and how the strategy that they're using the three aggregate plans of level workforce plus overtime, and a chase strategy to ensure that they can meet the demand while minimizing their overall cost. So 302, 303, and the tables that you see on 304 and 305, 306 is part of that overall example reference to the aggregate planning example. So that really concludes the discussion today on Chapter 12. And again, thank you so much for watching this video today.